The road stretched endlessly through the night. It was September 19th, 1961. Summer was fading into fall, and the air in New Hampshire carried a cool edge as the hills made their way home. Betty sat in the passenger seat, her gaze often drifting upward. The stars glittered with unusual clarity in the mountain sky. Beside her, Barney focused on the road, hands steady on the wheel, his posture disciplined as always. He had a way of carrying himself that suggested both responsibility and caution, the habits of a man who lived with care. They were tired but content. The trip to Canada had been refreshing, and now they were eager to return home to Portsmouth. It was a long drive through quiet roads and dark forests, the kind of drive where conversation falls away, replaced by the hum of tires against pavement and the whisper of wind through slightly open windows. The night was calm. Too calm. Betty noticed the first strange light. It was above the trees, distant at first, almost like a star. But it did not behave like a star. It moved. She leaned forward, watching closely. The light seemed to follow them, pacing the car's progress along the road. Sometimes it darted, sometimes it hovered. Barney, skeptical by nature, brushed it off at first. A plane, he said. A satellite. Something ordinary. Something explainable. But as the minutes passed, the light grew brighter, closer, stranger. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine yourself in that car, the road winding through mountains, darkness pressing against the windows, and above it all, a light that refuses to act like anything you have ever seen. Betty urged Barney to stop the car. She needed to see it more clearly. Reluctantly, he pulled over to the side of the road, near a picnic area. Together, they stepped into the night air, gazing upward. The light moved in silence. No hum of an engine, no roar of aircraft, just a silent glow, shifting with intelligence. Betty's heart raced. She had read about UFOs before, stories whispered on the edges of culture. But to see one herself, it felt unreal. Barney, ever practical, tried to measure what he saw against reason, but reason faltered. They returned to the car, unsettled, and drove on. Yet the light followed. Miles slipped by. The object drew nearer. It no longer felt like a distant star or satellite. It felt present, watching. At one point, it descended low enough that Barney pulled the car over again. This time, he reached for the binoculars they kept in the vehicle. Stepping into the road, he raised them to his eyes. What he saw shook him to his core. The object was no longer a distant light. It was a craft, large, structured, with windows. And behind those windows, Barney swore he saw figures. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. Feel his fear, his throat tightening, his hands trembling. The craft loomed silently, closer than any ordinary aircraft should dare. It tilted, as if turning its attention fully toward him. Barney's heart thundered. He dropped the binoculars, turned, and ran back to the car, shouting to Betty, "We have to get out of here." They sped away, the car rattling as it raced down the dark road. The object followed, a strange, metallic dance above them, keeping pace no matter how fast they drove. Betty clutched the dashboard, eyes wide, whispering prayers under her breath. Barney leaned forward, his jaw clenched, every instinct screaming that they were in danger. And then, silence. Not silence of sound, but silence of memory. The hills could not account for the next stretch of time. One moment, the craft hovered above them. The next, they were driving again, farther down the road, disoriented, confused, with a strange heaviness pressing over them. When they finally pulled into their driveway in Portsmouth, dawn was breaking. They were hours later than expected. The trip that should have taken less time had stretched unnaturally long. Betty's dress was torn. Barney's shoes were scuffed. Both felt an odd buzzing in their bodies, a weight of exhaustion far deeper than a long drive could explain. They looked at each other, bewildered, shaken, silent. Something had happened, something they could not yet name. The night ended in silence, but silence is not peace. When Betty and Barney pulled into their driveway in Portsmouth in the early hours of September 20th, dawn was just beginning to touch the horizon. Yet both of them felt as though they had been carried far beyond an ordinary night's drive. The house welcomed them, as it always did. Familiar walls, familiar rooms, familiar comforts. But they did not feel at home, not truly. A subtle strangeness clung to them, invisible but heavy, like a shadow that would not leave. Betty noticed her dress first. The hem was torn. The zipper, strange in its wear as though pulled by unseen hands. Barney's shoes were scuffed in places they never had been before. Their watches had stopped working. The car carried a faint metallic residue where the object had hovered above them. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine standing in your own driveway, staring at the small details of life that suddenly don't fit. Shoes scuffed, fabric torn, watches stilled, time itself unaccounted for. The couple tried to rest, but rest would not come. Their bodies were heavy, yet their minds restless. Betty especially could not shake the image of the lights, the craft, the figures behind glass. Her heart raced with questions. In the days that followed, she began to dream. The dreams came in fragments, vivid and unsettling. Dreams of being led through unfamiliar corridors, of strange beings with large eyes guiding her with calm precision. Dreams of medical examinations, of instruments cold against her skin, of voices that spoke not with words, but with presence. These were not ordinary dreams. They felt more like memories wrapped in shadow. Betty told Barney, but he resisted. Practical, cautious, he did not want to surrender to imagination. He wanted to push the night aside, to bury it in silence. But silence has a way of growing heavier the longer it is carried. Betty wrote down her dreams in detail, pages and pages, recorded carefully, as though she feared they would slip away. In those dreams, she remembered being separated from Barney. She remembered a group of beings who seemed curious, not cruel, yet utterly foreign. She remembered being shown a star map, lines connecting points of light, a pattern she could not forget. Barney's fear grew. He tried to tell himself it was only stress, only fatigue, only imagination. Yet he could not shake his own unease. He remembered the craft tilting above him, the figures watching, the sense of being observed by something that knew him in a way he did not want to be known. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine the weight of waking each morning with the feeling that you had been touched by something unseen. The hills tried to continue with life, work, chores, daily rhythms, but the strangeness lingered. They felt watched, unsettled. Their dog, usually calm, seemed nervous at times, pacing, whining at empty corners of the house. Friends noticed the change. Betty seemed distracted, her gaze often distant. Barney grew tense, his patience thinner. They were a couple bound not only by love, but by a secret neither fully understood. Eventually, they reached out. Betty called Peace Air Force Base, reporting what they had seen. The officer on the other end listened politely, then filed it as another UFO report. one among many in those years when sightings seemed to multiply across skies. But for Betty, speaking the words out loud was a release, a confession, an attempt to make sense of the night. Still, peace did not return. The dreams continued, the unease deepened, and the gap in their memory, the missing hours, refused to close. Breathe again. Inhale, exhale. The Hills were not conspiracy seekers. They were not looking for attention. They were quiet people, living quiet lives. But something had happened on that mountain road, something that would not let them go. And in the months that followed, the search for answers would draw them down a path neither had expected. A path into hypnosis, into testimony, into a story that would shape UFO history forever. The weeks became months, but the unease never left. Betty and Barney tried to live as though nothing had happened. But life does not return to normal once mystery has taken root. Each time they drove through the mountains, Betty's gaze lingered longer on the night sky. Each time Barney tried to sleep, the images returned. The tilted craft, the silent figures, the weight of fear pressing against his chest. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine lying in your own bed at night, shadows drifting across the ceiling, and wondering if the dark corners of your mind are memory or dream. For Betty, the dreams grew more insistent. She saw herself walking with beings who were small, pale, with large eyes that reflected light like pools of black glass. She felt their hands guiding her gently, their voices silent but clear. She dreamed of being led into a room filled with strange instruments. She dreamed of tests, of pressure, of samples taken. She dreamed of their calm presence, neither cruel nor kind, simply curious. Barney tried to push it all away, but even he felt the weight of something left unfinished. There were hours that could not be accounted for. Time lost, time erased, time that left them with questions too heavy to ignore. It was Betty who first reached out to the wider world. She wrote letters to UFO researchers. She contacted organizations that collected reports. Her words were steady, careful, but filled with urgency. Something had happened, something real, something more than a dream, and the responses began to come. Investigators visited their home, asked questions, listened closely. For the first time, Betty and Barney felt less alone. Others had seen lights. Others had spoken of missing time. Others whispered of encounters that defied explanation. Still, answers did not come. The couple remained unsettled, their health strained, their spirits heavy. Barney, especially, began to suffer. His sleep grew restless, his nerves frayed, his body carried tension he could not explain. He knew something had happened that night. He could feel it deep in his bones, but he could not name it. And so eventually, they sought help, not from researchers, not from officials, but from a doctor. In 1964, nearly 3 years after that September night, Betty and Barney turned to Dr. Benjamin Simon, a respected psychiatrist and neurologist in Boston. His specialty was hypnosis. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine sitting in that quiet office, the sound of the city outside muted, the walls lined with books, the faint ticking of a clock marking the passing of time. Imagine sitting in a chair, closing your eyes, and allowing your mind to drift into places you had tried so hard to forget. Dr. Simon agreed to work with them, not to prove aliens, not to chase headlines, but to heal the strain that weighed so heavily on them both. His goal was simple: to ease their anxiety, to uncover the roots of their distress. What he found instead was history. Under hypnosis, Barney's voice trembled as he spoke. He described the craft not as a distant light, but as something close, structured, hovering above the road. He described figures inside, their eyes fixed on him. He described being taken, not by force, but by presence, as though his will was no longer his own. Betty's voice followed in later sessions. She described her dreams not as imagination, but as memory. She remembered being separated from Barney, being examined, being shown a star map with lines connecting points of light. A map she could never forget. Dr. Simon listened carefully, his notes steady. To him, these were not evidence of visitors from the stars, but of trauma expressed through subconscious memory. Yet even he admitted the detail, the emotion, the consistency between Betty and Barney's accounts were striking. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. Because whether dream or memory, the story of that night now carried shape. And through those sessions, the Hills became the first couple in history to publicly describe what the world would come to call alien abduction. The mind holds secrets long after the body has returned home. For Betty and Barney Hill, those secrets lived in silence for nearly 3 years, heavy, unspoken, coiled in the corners of memory, like shadows refusing the light. But in 1964, in a quiet office in Boston, the shadows began to take shape. Dr. Benjamin Simon, calm and steady, guided them into hypnosis. His voice was even, his presence reassuring. He was not there to chase mystery, he was there to heal. Yet what emerged in those sessions became the foundation of a story that would change UFO history forever. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine the stillness of that room, the ticking of a clock, the shuffle of a pen across paper, the soft sound of a voice, leading you deeper and deeper into the place where memory and dream overlap. Barney went first. His voice trembled as he spoke, his breath ragged, his body tense, even as his mind drifted into that night. He described the lights, the craft, the sense of being drawn toward it against his will. "I'm scared," he whispered, "so scared." His hands clenched, even in the chair. His jaw tightened. Under hypnosis, the terror of that night returned in full. He described the beings, small, pale, with large eyes that held him captive without words. He remembered their gaze, not cruel, not kind, but overwhelming. He felt their control, the way his body moved without command, the way his will bent like grass in the wind. Barney wept. His voice broke. He spoke of being led up a ramp, of being separated from Betty, of being examined by hands that were not human. And then silence, a silence heavy with fear and awe. When it was Betty's turn, her voice was different, calm, more measured, but filled with detail. She spoke of the same beings, the same separation, the same presence that filled the craft. She described the rooms, narrow, metallic, filled with instruments that glinted under a soft light. She described the beings' curiosity, their calm gestures, their silent communication. They examined her. They took samples. She felt pressure on her skin, a cold touch against her head, against her hands. She remembered being told, silently, that no harm would come. And then came the map. In one of her sessions, Betty described being shown something extraordinary. One of the beings led her to a panel, where a map was displayed. Points of light connected by lines, some solid, some broken. She asked what it was. The being told her, the stars. The solid lines, she was told, were trade routes. The broken lines were expeditions. Betty could not forget the pattern. She drew it later, carefully, lines connecting stars in a way that seemed deliberate. At the time, no astronomer could make sense of it. But years later, a researcher matched her sketch to the star system of Zeta Reticuli, two sun-like stars in the southern sky, far from Earth, far from imagination. Close your eyes. Inhale, exhale. Hold that image in your mind. A simple star map, drawn by a woman who claimed it was shown to her on a craft not of this world. Dr. Simon listened, he guided, he noted. To him it was not proof of aliens. It was the language of trauma, expressed through subconscious imagery. Yet even he admitted the consistency was striking. Betty and Barney, hypnotized separately, told stories that matched in detail, in tone, in terror. The sessions were not easy. Barney's fear often left him shaking, drenched in sweat, his voice broken with sobs. Betty's calm descriptions carried their own weight, precise, deliberate, unforgettable. Together, their words painted the first full picture of what would become known as alien abduction. The lights, the craft, the beings, the examinations, the map. And when the sessions ended, the hills were changed. They had answers, yes, but answers bring their own weight. For now they carried not only the burden of silence, but the burden of memory. A memory too strange for most to believe. The sessions ended, but the silence did not return. For Betty and Barney Hill, hypnosis had not erased the weight they carried. It had deepened it. What had once been fragments, dreams, and shadows was now clear, vivid, unforgettable. They remembered the craft. They remembered the beings. They remembered the separation, the examinations, the map. And though they now carried understanding, they also carried something far heavier. How do you live in the world when you have seen another? Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine waking each morning, knowing that you had been lifted beyond the ordinary, touched by something no one around you would believe. Betty processed it with quiet strength. She spoke often of her dreams, of the sessions, of the way the memories felt like both trauma and revelation. Her eyes shone with conviction when she told her story. She believed fully that they had been chosen. Barney processed it with quiet dread. He spoke of it reluctantly, his voice heavy with fear. The sessions had left him shaken, his body tense, his sleep broken. For him, the memories were not a gift, but a wound. Together, they carried two truths, awe and fear. At first, they told almost no one. Dr. Simon kept the records, the transcripts, the tapes. The Hills wanted privacy, healing, rest. They did not seek fame. They did not seek the spotlight. But stories once spoken have a way of moving. Researchers who had followed their case whispered of it in conferences. Notes circulated. Pieces of their testimony slipped into the UFO community. And slowly, the Hills' quiet struggle became something much larger than themselves. In 1965, the story broke publicly. Newspapers ran headlines about a couple in New Hampshire who claimed to have been taken aboard a UFO. Skeptics scoffed, believers leaned closer, and the Hills were thrust unwillingly into history. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine opening your door to find reporters waiting. Imagine your neighbors glancing sideways at you in the grocery store. Imagine trying to go to work with whispers following you down the street. For Betty, the attention was both burden and opportunity. She wanted the truth known. She wanted people to understand what she and Barney had endured. She believed sharing their story could help others who carried similar silence. For Barney, the attention was torment. He hated the stares, the mockery, the questions that felt like accusations. He wanted to retreat, to forget, to disappear into normal life. But normal was gone. And then came the book. In 1966, author John G. Fuller published The Interrupted Journey, a detailed account of the Hills' experience. It included their testimony under hypnosis, their memories, their dreams. For the first time, the world could read, in detail the story of Betty and Barney Hill, the first widely known alien abduction case in history. The book changed everything. It was a sensation. Readers were captivated, unsettled, drawn into the idea that ordinary people on an ordinary night could be pulled into something extraordinary. For some, it was proof that humanity was not alone. For others, it was fantasy, delusion, the product of stress and suggestion. But no one ignored it. The Hills story became a touchstone, a foundation for every abduction account that followed. Missing time, strange dreams, hypnotic recall, beings with large eyes, medical examinations, star maps. The language of abduction was written, and the Hills were its first authors. Close your eyes, inhale, exhale. Feel the enormity of that legacy. For Betty and Barney, it was not legacy. It was life. It was strain on their marriage, strain on their health, strain on their peace. Fame had not been sought, but it had found them, and it demanded a price. Still, they endured. They spoke at times. They answered questions. They carried the story as best they could. Because even under ridicule, even under doubt, they knew what they had experienced. And the world, whether it believed or not, would never forget. Not every memory can be measured. But some memories leave patterns that beg to be studied. The broken lines were exploration paths. The image stayed with her, as vivid as if it had been drawn into her mind with fire. After the hypnosis sessions, Betty drew the map as best she could, careful to preserve the placement of the stars, the connections, the angles. To her, it was more than memory. It was evidence. Breathe slowly. Inhale, exhale. Picture the image, a cluster of stars, some linked by bold lines, others by faint ones, forming a pattern that looked less like chance and more like design. At first, astronomers dismissed it. Too vague, they said. Too open to interpretation. The night sky is vast. One could find such patterns anywhere if they searched long enough. But in the early 1970s, a schoolteacher and amateur astronomer named Marjorie Fish took a closer look. She constructed three-dimensional models of nearby stars, using string and beads to map out their positions in space. It was meticulous work, the kind of labor born of quiet conviction. And as she aligned the points, she noticed something startling. Betty's map seemed to match a real region of space. The pattern corresponded closely to the star system known as Zeta Reticuli, two sun-like stars located about 39 light-years from Earth, in the constellation Reticulum. Not only that, but the solid lines in Betty's drawing aligned with plausible trade routes between habitable stars, while the broken lines stretched into more distant reaches. The discovery electrified believers. Here, at last, was something testable, something that could not be dismissed as dream or fantasy. Betty, under hypnosis, had described and drawn a map she could not have known, and yet the match to Zeta Reticuli seemed undeniable. Skeptics countered quickly. Coincidence, they said. A pattern found after the fact. A case of wishful thinking aligning dots in the sky. They pointed out that astronomy itself was still evolving, that new data could change star positions, that the match was not perfect. But the image endured. Because what mattered was not whether every star aligned perfectly. What mattered was the possibility that Betty Hill, a woman with no training in astronomy, had glimpsed a map that pointed to real stars across the void. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine holding that map in your hands, feeling the strangeness of its lines, knowing that it came not from imagination, but from a night when time itself had gone missing. The Zeta Reticuli connection gave the Hills story a new dimension. It was no longer only about lights in the sky, missing time, or examinations aboard a craft. It was about place, a possible origin, a suggestion that the beings Betty and Barney encountered were not nameless wanderers, but travelers from a specific system, one far beyond our reach, yet mapped in her memory. For decades afterward, Zeta Reticuli became a phrase whispered in UFO circles, a shorthand for alien origin, a symbol of the Hills encounter. And whether proof or coincidence, the star map became one of the most enduring mysteries in all of UFO history. Stories have power. Some fade after a season. Others grow until they shape the imagination of an entire world. The story of Betty and Barney Hill was one of those. When The Interrupted Journey was published in 1966, it did more than tell the private struggles of a couple from New Hampshire. It opened a door. It invited the world into a new kind of narrative, one that would become the blueprint for all alien abduction stories that followed. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine yourself sitting in an armchair in the mid-1960s, reading the Hills' testimony for the first time. The world around you is filled with Cold War tension, space race ambition, fear of the unknown, and hope for discovery. And here, in your hands, is a book that suggests ordinary people have already encountered travelers from the stars. The impact was immediate. Newspapers ran features. Radio hosts debated the story late into the night. Neighbors whispered. Teachers, doctors, soldiers, housewives, people of every walk of life found themselves asking, could it be true? Could such a thing really happen here, to people so ordinary, so much like us? And then came the images. Artists illustrated the beings Betty and Barney described, small, pale, with large, slanted eyes that seemed to hold both calmness and command. These drawings became iconic, slowly merging into what the world now recognizes as the classic alien. The Gray. Before the Hills, UFO reports spoke of many forms, tall beings, glowing figures, humanoids of all shapes and sizes. But after the Hills, the image sharpened. The Gray became the face of alien encounters, a template etched into popular imagination. Television soon followed. In 1975, the Hills story was dramatized in a made-for-TV film titled The UFO Incident, starring James Earl Jones as Barney and Estelle Parsons as Betty. For millions, it was the first time the story came alive on screen. The fear, the silence, the map, the eyes. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. Feel the power of seeing private memory become public performance, flickering across televisions in living rooms around the world. The movie cemented the Hills' place in culture. It gave a face and voice to the story, allowing audiences to step into that car, to feel the terror of the lights overhead, to walk with Betty into the dreamlike corridors of the craft. From then on, the story was no longer only theirs. It belonged to the culture. Researchers continued to analyze it. Skeptics continued to dismiss it. But artists, writers, filmmakers, they drew inspiration. Novels wove echoes of it. Comic books hinted at it. Musicians even referenced it. And always, the gray eyes stared back from posters, books, and screens, carrying with them the weight of that first abduction tale. For the Hills themselves, the cultural storm was double-edged. Betty embraced it. She gave lectures, answered questions, shared her experiences with conviction. She felt it was her duty, not for fame, but for truth. She wanted people to know what had happened, to take the phenomenon seriously. Barney, however, struggled. He was more private, more fragile under the gaze of strangers. The attention weighed on him. The ridicule stung. The very story that fascinated the world haunted him most of all. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. Because this is the paradox of great stories. They free the imagination of millions, but they trap the lives of those who live them. By the 1970s, Betty and Barney Hill were no longer just a couple from New Hampshire. They were symbols. Symbols of mystery. Symbols of belief. Symbols of doubt. And their story, woven into books, films, and endless retellings, Sravada style, became the foundation of modern UFO lore. Every extraordinary story attracts two kinds of listeners. Those who lean forward, eyes wide, whispering, "What if?" And those who fold their arms, shaking their heads, insisting, "It can't be." The story of Betty and Barney Hill was no different. From the moment their testimony became public, scientists, psychologists, and skeptics set to work, determined to pull the mystery back down to earth. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine the tension of that time, a world captivated by the possibility of contact, and a world equally determined to explain it away. Psychologists were among the first to weigh in. Some argued that Betty's vivid dreams were simply the product of stress, a long road trip, fatigue, anxiety about her interracial marriage in a time of prejudice. Perhaps the lights in the sky were ordinary, but Betty's mind had spun them into something larger, a narrative of contact, fueled by imagination. They said Barney's fear under hypnosis was not evidence of memory, but of suggestion. That Dr. Simon's sessions may have drawn from Betty's dreams, weaving them into Barney's subconscious until he believed them his own. The idea of confabulation, the subconscious invention of detail, became a favored explanation. Under stress, under suggestion, the mind can create what it needs to fill silence. To skeptics, this explained the abduction story in full. Astronomers weighed in as well. They pointed to Venus, bright in the autumn sky. They pointed to planes flying over New England airspace. They pointed to stars low on the horizon, shimmering with atmospheric distortion. They argued that the hills had mistaken the ordinary for the extraordinary. And then, always, there was the question of the map. Some dismissed it as coincidence, a vague sketch that could be matched to any region of stars with enough imagination. Others criticized Marjorie Fish's model, arguing that astronomy itself was evolving, that new data would weaken the match to Zeta Reticuli. Government officials, too, took interest, not because they believed in aliens, but because the Cold War made every unexplained object in the sky a matter of concern. The U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book cataloged thousands of sightings, and the Hills report was among them. Their case was labeled unexplained, but officials did not linger. The nation's eyes were on earthly threats. Still, the skeptics could not erase the weight of testimony, because Betty and Barney had been interviewed separately. Their hypnosis sessions revealed details that aligned too closely to dismiss. Their voices carried sincerity, not the tones of fantasy seekers. They did not want fame. They wanted peace. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. Feel the divide. One world insisting it was stress, suggestion, Venus on the horizon. Another world insisting it was memory, contact, the first true abduction in modern history. The skeptics asked, why would beings cross light years to abduct a couple in rural New Hampshire? Why not contact governments or announce themselves openly? Why Betty? Why Barney? Believers answered, Perhaps because contact always begins in the quiet. Perhaps because the extraordinary chooses the ordinary. And so the debate lived on. To scientists, the Hills' story was psychology. To believers, it was history. To skeptics, it was error. To culture, it was myth. But beneath all the noise, Betty and Barney Hill remained what they had always been. Two people who drove home one night and returned forever changed. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. Science offered explanations. Skepticism offered doubt. But neither erased the silence between memories. Neither erased the missing time. Neither erased the tears in Barney's voice, the conviction in Betty's eyes, the map drawn from a place she should never have known. And so, the questions endured, because some mysteries refuse to be solved by doubt alone. Every great mystery has a human cost. Behind the headlines, the books, the television specials, there were still only two people, Betty and Barney Hill, a couple who had simply been driving home one September night, a couple who never asked for history to choose them. And yet, history had. Breathe slowly. Inhale, exhale. Imagine their small home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a modest house filled with ordinary belongings, books, photographs, the sound of a dog's paws across the floor, and within it, two lives made extraordinary by a story they could never set down. Barney carried the weight most heavily. He was a quiet man by nature, serious, responsible, a postal worker, a husband, a veteran. His life had been defined by duty and caution. He did not enjoy attention, and he recoiled from the public gaze their story drew. After hypnosis, his fear deepened. Each session had torn open emotions buried in silence. He had wept, shouted, trembled. Those memories were not dreamlike to him. They were raw, visceral, unbearable. He could feel the eyes upon him. He could feel his body moving against his will. He could feel the terror of that night as though it never ended. Barney's health began to falter. He developed ulcers. He battled anxiety. He carried tension in his chest that no doctor could ease. The ridicule of skeptics cut deeply, sharper than he ever admitted aloud. By the late 1960s, his health had declined significantly. In 1969, at only 46 years old, Barney Hill died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. Feel the silence of that moment. The man who had stood on that dark road, who had raised binoculars to his eyes and seen figures that should not exist, gone too soon, leaving Betty to carry the story alone. For Betty, the years after Barney's passing were both lonely and luminous. She never stopped telling the story. She spoke at conferences. She granted interviews. She welcomed believers into her home, sharing her files, her letters, her conviction that what she and Barney experienced was real. To her, it was not fantasy, it was truth. She believed the beings they met were explorers, not invaders. Curious, not cruel. She believed the star map was genuine. She believed her dreams and memories were a gift, a glimpse into a larger universe. But even Betty carried scars. Skeptics mocked her. Some dismissed her as delusional. Others accused her of seeking attention. Over time, she grew more isolated from the mainstream, more rooted in the community of UFO believers who saw her as a pioneer. Yet through it all, she remained steadfast. Until her death in 2004, she never once retracted her story, never once softened her conviction. Her final years were quiet but resolute. She spoke with the same certainty she had in the 1960s. Her voice did not waver. Her eyes still carried the same light. Because for Betty, what had happened was not only an event, it was a calling. Close your eyes again. Inhale. Exhale. Think of them together. Barney, cautious, burdened, wounded. Betty, determined, steadfast, unyielding. Two people bound not only by love but by a night that changed history. Their marriage had carried strain. Yes, the weight of the abduction pressed heavily upon them both. But their bond endured until Barney's last day. They were united in silence, united in memory, united in a truth too large for the world to accept. And so, the human cost of their story was clear. For Barney, an early death, a life cut short under the pressure of fear and ridicule. For Betty, a lifetime of defending a truth that the world could not fully embrace. Yet together, they left a legacy larger than either could have imagined. Because every abduction story that followed, every whisper of missing time, every drawing of large dark eyes, every memory of a craft in the night, traced its roots back to them. Betty and Barney Hill, two ordinary people who carried an extraordinary burden.
Stories do not end when the storytellers pass. Some grow larger, some grow quieter, some live on in the imagination of generations. The story of Betty and Barney Hill has done all three. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine the arc of their lives stretching far beyond the moment of September 1961 into books, films, debates, whispers in the night, and the countless retellings that came after. By the time Betty passed away in 2004, more than 40 years had passed since that night on the New Hampshire highway. Yet their story had not faded. It had become the foundation of an entire genre of experience: alien abduction. Before the Hills, UFO stories were mostly about lights in the sky. Strange objects darting, hovering, flashing, mysteries glimpsed at a distance. But after the Hills, the narrative changed. It was no longer just about what was seen. It was about what was felt, what was remembered, what was endured. The Hills introduced the world to missing time, to hypnotic recall, to beings with large, dark eyes, to medical examinations aboard a craft, to star maps drawn from memory. Every abduction story that followed, from Travis Walton in Arizona, to the children of Zimbabwe, to countless whispered accounts never written down, carried echoes of Betty and Barney. Their testimony became the template, the language of contact. Researchers called their case the cornerstone. Skeptics called it the first and most elaborate fantasy. But whether believed or doubted, it was never ignored. Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. In UFO conferences, their names are spoken with reverence. In documentaries, their faces appear, voices trembling, telling what they could not forget. In books, their story is retold again and again, each author shaping it through the lens of their own belief or disbelief. And beyond the research, beyond the debate, their story reached into culture itself. Television shows borrowed its details. Science fiction films mirrored its imagery. The gray alien, now so familiar in posters, art, and imagination, rose from the sketches inspired by Betty and Barney's testimony. Even spiritual seekers found meaning in it. For some, the Hill story was not about fear, but about awakening, a reminder that humanity is not alone, that there are others in the universe watching, studying, guiding. For others, it was a cautionary tale, proof of vulnerability, of powers beyond human control. The story lives in both awe and dread, and so, Betty and Barney Hill became more than a couple from New Hampshire. They became symbols, symbols of mystery, symbols of possibility, symbols of the thin line between dream and reality. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. Let the weight of their legacy settle. Because in the end, their story is not only about what happened to them. It is about what happens to all of us, when we hear it. We imagine ourselves on that dark road. We feel the fear of lights following our car. We sense the silence of missing hours. We wonder if we too would wake from dreams that feel like memories. That is the true legacy of Betty and Barney Hill. Not proof, not dismissal, but wonder. Wonder that two ordinary people could open the door to an extraordinary story that still whispers across generations.
Time has a way of softening edges. What once sparks controversy becomes legend. What once divides belief becomes a story retold, reshaped, reimagined. So it is with Betty and Barney Hill. More than 60 years have passed since their drive through the White Mountains. The road has changed. The world has changed. Yet their story has not slipped away. If anything, it has grown stronger, like a tree that keeps widening its rings with each passing year. Breathe slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Imagine standing today at the spot where the hills first saw the light. A marker now stands there, quietly acknowledging their place in history. The forest is the same, tall, still, whispering with wind, and above, the stars still glitter just as they did on that September night. Researchers still study their case. Books still analyze the details. Podcasts still recount the hours of missing time. And every retelling carries the same pull, the same mixture of awe and unease, the same lingering sense that something beyond our understanding once reached down and touched two ordinary lives. Skeptics continue their work. They still point to stress, to suggestion, to dreams reshaped under hypnosis. They say the star map was coincidence, the craft was imagination, the memory was fragile. But believers, too, continue. They point to consistency, to sincerity, to the way Betty and Barney told their story not for fame, but because silence was heavier than speech. They point to Barney's terror, Betty's conviction, the endurance of details that have echoed in abduction reports ever since. And so the debate endures. Yet the edges of the debate have softened. No longer is it only about proof or denial. Now it is also about meaning. What does their story say about us? What does it reveal about our hunger for mystery? What does it whisper about the possibility that we are not alone? Close your eyes. Inhale. Exhale. For many, the Hills story has become more than an account. It has become a ritual, a bedtime story told softly, not only to stir fear, but to lull us into wonder. A reminder that the night sky is alive with secrets, that the silence between stars may not be empty after all. Some find comfort in that. The idea that humanity is not solitary, that other minds watch from afar. Others find dread in it, the fear that we are vulnerable, observed, studied. But either way, the story continues to live. Betty and Barney Hill are remembered not only as witnesses, but as pioneers. They opened the door to a conversation that still shapes science, spirituality, and imagination today. They became, unwillingly, the first faces of a new chapter in human mythology. And in that way, their story has achieved something rare. It has transcended doubt. It has transcended ridicule. It has become part of culture itself, woven into the fabric of how we imagine our place in the cosmos. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. Because whether you believe or doubt, the Hills story invites you into silence, into the quiet space where wonder lives, into the soft edge of sleep, where dreams and memory mingle, just as they did for Betty in her visions, just as they did for Barney in his terror. And perhaps that is why their story still lingers. Not because it can be proven, not because it can be erased, but because it is dreamlike. It belongs not only to history, but to the threshold between waking and sleep.
The road is quiet again.
Imagine it, the dark stretch of highway in the White Mountains, the faint hum of tires against asphalt, the silence of trees on either side. For most travelers, it is only a road home, but for Betty and Barney Hill, it became a passage into history. It began so simply, a late-night drive, a light in the sky, a pause on the roadside to look closer. But what unfolded from that moment reshaped the rest of their lives. Breathe slowly. Inhale, exhale. Let yourself walk that road in your imagination. You see the stars above, bright and cold. You hear the steady rhythm of night insects, the soft whisper of wind through leaves. And then there it is, a light, moving where no light should move. For Betty, it was curiosity. For Barney, it was fear. Together, they stepped into a mystery larger than either could comprehend. They returned home with missing hours, torn fabric, stilled watches, and memories too heavy to surface all at once. Years later, under hypnosis, those memories emerged. The beings, the separation, the examinations, the map of stars. Details that would echo across decades, shaping every abduction story that followed. But beyond the debates, beyond the skepticism, beyond the arguments about maps and memory, the Hill story remains something simpler. It is the story of two people who encountered the unknown. Close your eyes. Inhale, exhale. Feel the weight of that truth. Betty and Barney were not looking for the extraordinary. They were simply living, simply traveling, simply returning home. And yet, the extraordinary found them. That is why their story lingers, because it reminds us that the universe is not silent, that the skies above may carry more than stars, that the boundary between dream and waking is thinner than we admit. And as you drift toward sleep, you can carry that wonder with you. Imagine again the star map Betty described. Glowing points connected by lines, solid and broken, stretching into the vastness of space. Imagine the beings who showed it to her, calm and deliberate, as if offering a glimpse into a greater web of life. Imagine Barney, binoculars in hand, heart pounding, as he realized the light was not distant but near, not ordinary but extraordinary. Imagine the tears in his voice as memory returned, his fear unshaken even decades later. Imagine Betty, steadfast, recording her dreams, holding her conviction through ridicule, carrying the story into her final days with quiet certainty. Together, they left a legacy, not only of fear, not only of awe, but of wonder. And that wonder can be yours now, as you close your eyes and let the night carry you into dreams. Breathe again. Inhale. Exhale. Let the forest fade. Let the car's hum dissolve. Let the stars above become soft points of light, guiding you gently into rest. Because the Hill story is not only about what they saw, it is about what we feel when we hear it. We feel the strangeness of silence. We feel the weight of mystery. We feel the comfort of knowing that the universe is wide, alive, and still filled with secrets. So sleep now. Let Betty and Barney's journey guide you into your own. Let the stars above remind you that life is greater than what is seen. Let the unknown become a lullaby, steady and soft, carrying you deeper into rest. The road is quiet again. The sky is vast. The story is yours to carry, gently, into dream. Good night.